From time to time, we all ask some deep and difficult questions. Why is the world filled with trouble? How can we make it better? How can we give meaning and purpose to our lives? Well, as imponderable as these questions may seem, many people have answers to these questions. For example, morality is dictated by God in Holy Scriptures. When everyone obeys His laws, the world will be perfect. Or, problems are the fault of evil people who must be shamed, punished, and defeated. Or, our tribe should claim its rightful greatness under the control of a strong leader who embodies its authentic virtue. Or, in the past, we lived in a state of order and harmony until alien forces brought on decadence and degeneration. We must restore the society to its golden age. Well, what about the rest of us? Many people today know what they don't believe in, but it's harder for them to put their fingers on what they do believe in. In my book, Enlightenment Now, I suggest that there is an alternative system of beliefs and values, the one that originated with the Enlightenment 250 years ago. In a nutshell, that we can use knowledge to enhance human flourishing. Many people embrace the ideals of the Enlightenment without being able to name or describe them. And as a result, they faded into the background as a bland default or status quo or establishment. The other ideologies have passionate advocates, and I suggest that Enlightenment ideals too need a positive defense and an explicit commitment, and that is what I have tried to do. The Enlightenment, I suggest, revolves around four themes: reason, science, humanism, and progress, and I'll say a few words about each. It all begins with reason, with the understanding that traditional sources of belief are generators of delusion. Faith, revelation, tradition, authority, charisma, mysticism, intuition, the parsing of sacred texts are all ways of being wrong. Reason, in contrast, is non-negotiable. As soon as you try to provide reasons why we should trust anything other than reason, as soon as you start to explain why you're right, why other people should believe you, as soon as you insist that you're not lying or full of crap, you've lost the argument because you have appealed to reason. Now, as a cognitive psychologist, I would be the first to acknowledge that human beings on their own are not particularly reasonable. We, as a species, we tend to generalize from anecdotes. We reason from stereotypes. We tend to seek evidence that confirms our beliefs and ignore evidence that disconfirms them. And we're all overconfident about our knowledge, our wisdom, and our rectitude. But people are capable of reason if they adopt certain norms: free speech, open criticism and debate, logical analysis, fact-checking, and empirical testing, which leads to the second Enlightenment ideal, science. Science is based on the conviction that the world is intelligible and that we can understand it by formulating possible explanations and testing them against reality. Science has shown itself to be our most reliable means of understanding the world, including ourselves. A key Enlightenment belief was that there can be a science of human nature, and that beliefs about society are testable, just like other beliefs about the world. Science, moreover, provides not just technical know-how, but fundamental insights about the human condition. Naturalism. The universe has no goal or purpose related to human welfare, with the implication that if we want to improve that welfare, we have to figure out how to do it ourselves. Entropy. In a closed system without input of energy, disorder increases. Things fall apart, stuff happens. Not because the universe has it in for us, but just because there are vastly more ways for things to go wrong than for things to go right. And evolution. Humans are products of a competitive process which selects for reproductive success, not for well-being. As Immanuel Kant put it at the height of the Enlightenment, out of the crooked timber of humanity, no truly straight thing can be built. The third theme is humanism, that the ultimate moral purpose is to reduce the suffering and enhance the flourishing of human beings and other sentient creatures. Well, enhancing human flourishing. Who could be against that, you might think? Well, in fact, there are alternatives to humanism, such as that the ultimate good is to enhance the glory of the tribe, the nation, the race, the class, or the faith, to obey the dictates of a divinity and pressure others to do the same, to achieve feats of heroic greatness, or to advance a mystical force or dialectic or struggle or pursuit of a utopian or messianic age. Humanism is feasible because people are endowed with a sense of sympathy, a concern with the welfare of others. Now, by default, our circle of sympathy is rather small. We tend to feel the pain only of our biological relatives, our good friends, our close allies, cute little furry baby animals, and that's about it. But the circle of sympathy can be expanded through the forces of cosmopolitanism, the mixing of people and ideas, including education, journalism, art, mobility, and even reason itself. As soon as I enter into conversation with you, I can't insist that only my interests are special because I'm me and you're not, and hope for you to take me seriously. The very act of engaging in reason presupposes a symmetry of viewpoints and an interchangeability of interests. Finally, that takes us to progress, that if we apply knowledge and sympathy to reduce suffering and enhance flourishing, we can gradually succeed. Now, you might ask, if human nature doesn't change, how can progress be possible? And an answer from the Enlightenment is that it's possible through benign institutions, which allow us to deploy energy and knowledge to push back against entropy, which magnify the better angels of our nature, such as Abraham Lincoln called them, such as reason and sympathy, while marginalizing our inner demons, our biases, our illusions, our tribalism, our thirst for dominance and vengeance. What do I mean by institutions? Well, some of the brainchildren of the Enlightenment that we continue to enjoy today include democracy, declarations of rights, markets, organizations for global cooperation, and institutions of truth-seeking, such as academies, scientific societies, and a free press. So, 250 years later, how did that Enlightenment thing work out? Well, I have found that if you ask most intellectuals, the answer is not very well, because I have found that intellectuals hate progress. And intellectuals who call themselves progressive really hate progress. If you think that we can solve problems, I have been told, that means you have a blind faith and a quasi-religious belief in the outmoded superstition of the false promise of the myth of the onward march of inevitable progress. You are a cheerleader for vulgar American can-doism, with the rah-rah spirit of boardroom ideology, Silicon Valley, and the Chamber of Commerce. You are a practitioner of Whig history, a naive optimist, a Pollyanna, and of course a Pangloss, alluding to Voltaire's character who declared all is for the best in the best of all possible worlds. Well, as it happens, Pangloss is what we would today call a pessimist. A true optimist believes there can be much better worlds than the one that we find ourselves in today. But all of this is irrelevant because progress is not, the question of whether progress has taken place is not a matter of looking on the bright side or wearing rose-tinted glasses or seeing the glass as half full. It's an empirical hypothesis. Human well-being can be measured. Life, health, sustenance, prosperity, peace, freedom, safety, knowledge, leisure, happiness. If they have increased over time, I submit, that is progress. Let's look at the data. Beginning with the most precious thing of all, life. For most of human history, life expectancy at birth hovered around 30 years of age. But then, with the invention of vaccination, later of sanitation, still later antibiotics, and other advances in public health and medicine, life expectancy at birth has grown over the entire world to 71 years. And virtually no one guesses that it's that high. As with many of the examples of progress that I will walk you through, this progression from universal early death and squalor and suffering was highly uneven across the world's regions. Europe and the Americas were the first to make the great escape from low life expectancy, but Asia has almost caught up in the 20th century, and Africa is making spectacular gains as well. For most of human history, the biggest contributor to low lifespans was child mortality, the death of children during the vulnerable first few years of life. In Sweden in 1750, for example, 1/3 of children did not live to see their 5th birthday. Sweden brought their rate of child mortality down by a factor of 100, and other regions of the world followed suit. In North America, Canada; in Asia, South Korea; in Latin America, Chile; and in sub-Saharan Africa, Ethiopia, whose rate of child mortality has fallen from 25% to 6% in just a few decades. Still too high, but the progress is continuing. Mothers, too, were vulnerable to sudden death every time they bore a child. In Sweden, in the 18th century, there was a 1% chance that a woman would die every time she gave birth. That was reduced by a factor of 250, and as it was in other parts of the world, such as the United States, Malaysia, and Ethiopia. Health. For most of human history, the biggest killer was infectious disease, which is no longer a major cause of mortality in the developed world, but it is still a major killer in the developing world. However, even in the developing world, the 5 most lethal infectious diseases, most lethal especially for children, have all been reduced just in the last dozen years: pneumonia, diarrhea, malaria, measles, and HIV/AIDS. Sustenance. It takes about 2,500 calories to sustain a young active male. And for most of human history, no country could grow that many calories for its population until the agricultural revolution in Britain in the 18th century, with the development of advances in agronomy, such as crop rotation, later the invention of synthetic fertilizers, the mechanization of agriculture, and the selective breeding of vigorous hybrids, especially with the green revolution of the 50s and 60s, most parts of the world have been able to feed themselves, including in Asia, China, and India. Here you have the graph for the world as a whole. Now, this would be a dubious example of progress if all those calories were just going to make fat people still fatter. But in fact, they have reduced the rate of undernourishment, which in 1970 affected 35% of people in the developing world. That has fallen to less than 15%, first in Latin America, then in Asia, and it's now happening in sub-Saharan Africa. The most extreme suffering from insufficient calories, of course, takes place during famines. Famine was one of the 4 horsemen of the apocalypse, and throughout human history could wreak devastation on any part of the world. Today, famine takes place only in the most remote and war-torn parts of the world. Famines today are not caused by crop failures or insufficient calories, but from armies and governments that prevent the food from getting to the people who need it. Prosperity. For most of human history, there was little to no economic growth to speak of. This graph shows the gross world product from the year 1 to the present. And as you can see, for most of history, economic growth was less than 1 pixel high per century. Until the Industrial Revolution in the 18th century, the advances in technology, particularly energy capture, the spread of education, the development of financial markets, and later the globalization of trade have all worked together to increase the gross world product by a factor of 200 since the 18th century. Again, the great escape from universal poverty and squalor was uneven. It took place first in European countries like the UK and Germany and in the United States, but more recently South Korea and other East Asian tigers have almost caught up. Latin America is showing rapid growth, and China and India are beginning to show exponential growth as well. Now, once again, you might say that this would not count as progress if all of that extra wealth was just going to the proverbial 1%. But in fact, it has been applied to decimate the rate of extreme poverty, defined roughly as the bare minimum necessary to feed oneself and operationalized as $1.90 per person per day. By that standard, 200 years ago, 90% of the world lived in extreme poverty. That has fallen to 9%. In fact, the rate of extreme poverty has fallen by 75% just in the last 30 years. Many economists call this the greatest achievement in all of human history, and virtually no one knows about it. As a result of the reduction in extreme poverty, international inequality, the gap between rich countries and poor countries, which necessarily grew when a few countries escaped from universal poverty, has now turned a corner and is beginning to decline because poor countries are getting richer faster than rich countries are getting richer. Now, of course, within developed countries, inequality among people is increasing, not decreasing. That does not mean that developed countries have turned their back on the needy. For most of European history, developed countries spent no more than 1.5% of their GDP on social spending, such as the poor, the sick, the elderly, and children. In the 20th century, every developed country went on a binge of social spending, so that today the median OECD country redistributes 22% of its GDP to children, the elderly, the poor, and the sick. As a result, poverty in developed countries, when it's measured net of government benefits, has fallen from about 1/3 in 1960 in the United States to 7% today. And when poverty is measured in terms of consumption, the food, clothing, and shelter that people can afford to buy, it's fallen from 30% to less than 3%. Peace. For most of European history, the natural state of international relations was war, and peace was merely a brief interlude between wars. You can see that in this graph, which plots the percentage of years in each quarter century that the great powers of the day, the 800-pound gorillas, the major states and empires, were at each other's throats in wars. And what you see is that 300 years ago, the great powers were pretty much always at war. Now they are never at war. The last great power war pitted the United States against China in Korea 65 years ago. Now, if we zoom in on the 20th century, we see that even as wars were getting less frequent and shorter, they also got more destructive, culminating in the two world wars, which brought unprecedented damage in a short amount of time. But contrary to predictions that I and many people in this room grew up with, that it was only a matter of time before there would be a third world war pitting the United States against the Soviet Union, and because it would be fought with nuclear weapons, it would be even more destructive than the first two world wars. The Cold War ended, the Soviet Union went out of existence largely peacefully, and World War III never happened. In fact, if we zoom in on the post-war period, we see that there has been quite a dramatic decline in the rate of death in wars of all kinds, from about 20 per 100,000 per year in the late 40s and early 50s to 1.2 today. This bumpy but unmistakable decline in war is a gift of the spread of democracy, because democracies are slightly less likely to fight each other. Of commerce, because countries that engage in trade are less likely to go to war against each other. You don't kill your customers, you don't kill your debtors, and if it's cheaper to buy something than to steal it, then you're less likely to invade and plunder another country. It's also in part a dividend of peacekeeping forces, which insert themselves between belligerents, like referees in a hockey game, and international institutions and norms that no longer recognize conquest as a legitimate way of settling disputes between countries. Not that conquests never happen, as we saw in Crimea in 2014. But prior to 1945, there were about 30 Crimea-size annexations on average every year, and now they have become extremely rare. Freedom and rights. We have all read with mounting alarm about the assault on democracy in countries such as Turkey, Russia, Poland, Venezuela. Still, if you count up the number of democracies and autocracies across the world over the last 2 centuries, you see that the world has never been more democratic than it is in this decade. Now, some people find this hard to believe, and I suspect less so in this particular location, but several decades ago, of course, half of Europe was behind the Iron Curtain and lived under communist totalitarian dictatorships. Spain and Portugal were literally fascist dictatorships. Greece was under the control of a military junta. Most of Latin America was ruled by right-wing military governments, as was in East Asia, Taiwan, South Korea, Philippines, Indonesia, all of them democratic today. The exercise of violence by governments has also been in decline in a number of spheres, such as the death penalty, which has been abolished in country after country. If the current trend continues, which it almost certainly won't, but just if we extrapolated that curve, capital punishment would vanish from the face of the earth by 2026. Now, the United States is an outlier to this, and I should add to a number of trends that the United States still executes people. But even in the United States, the trend has been downward, and just last week, Washington became the 20th state to abolish capital punishment. And even states that love to execute people, like Texas and Mississippi, the rate of execution has been falling. Just one other example is that country after country has decriminalized homosexuality, most recently India just 1 month ago. Child labor. For most of history, about a third of children were set to work in fields and factories. England and the United States brought the rate of child labor down in the early part of the 20th century, followed by other parts of Europe, such as Italy, and it's a process that is taking place in the world as a whole. This is a result of the growth of affluence, so parents don't have to send their kids out to work, to the premium that we put on education, so it's better to have a child that's educated than an extra pair of hands on the farm, and a general valuation of the lives of children. Today often manifest in activism against child labor. The 2015 Nobel Peace Prize went to Kailash Satyarthi, shared Peace Prize, for his efforts at reducing child labor worldwide, and the 2 black lines show that the progress is real. Violent crime. In any part of the world that exists in a state of anarchy, there will be high rates of interpersonal violence, from predation, from revenge, from retaliation, which can spiral into blood feuds and vendettas. In medieval Europe, for example, the homicide rate was 35 per 100,000 per year, until the spread of consolidated kingdoms brought the medieval patchwork of fiefs and baronies under the control of kings who imposed law and order on their new kingdoms. And so the rate of homicide plunged by about a factor of 35 in every European country, from 35 per 100,000 per year to about 1 per 100,000 per year. That process is repeated whenever governments pacify their frontier regions, and the code of vendetta is replaced by the police and court system and the rule of law. It happened again in colonial New England. It happened again in the American Wild West. And it even happened in Mexico, which has not managed to bring its homicide rate down to what the rest of the world enjoys. Mexico has one of the highest homicide rates, but still it was 3 times as high a century ago. If we zoom in on the last 50 years or so, we see that in the United States, like many Western countries, underwent something of a violent crime binge in the 60s, 70s, and 80s, but has now reduced its rate of homicide by a factor of 2, and the world as a whole has seen a 30% reduction in homicide just in the last 2 decades. Not just homicide, but other forms of violence, such as violence against women. The rates of domestic violence, violence against wives and girlfriends, has come down, and rates of rape and sexual assault have declined by 75% in the United States since records were first kept in the 1970s. And despite all the horror that we experience as we read about children being bullied, the rate of victimizing children at school has actually fallen, as have rates of physical abuse and sexual abuse. Indeed, we've become safer in just about every way because of advances in car safety, such as seat belts and airbags, because of the design of better highways and better enforcement of traffic laws. Your chance of getting killed in a car accident have declined by about 96%. We are 88% less likely to be mowed down on the sidewalk, 99% less likely to perish in a plane crash, 59% less likely to fall to our deaths, 90% less likely to drown, 92% less likely to burn to death, 92% less likely to be asphyxiated, but there is one exception to the trend of increased safety, at least in the United States, and that is in the category that safety engineers call poisoning by solid or liquid, and here you are seeing the American opioid epidemic. At the same time, there's been a 95% drop in the rate of dying on the job. There has even been a decline in the so-called acts of God. Deaths from droughts, floods, wildfires, storms, volcanoes, landslides, meteor strikes, and earthquakes, presumably not because God is any less angry at us, but because of improvements in the resilience of our infrastructure and in emergency response systems. Well, what about the quintessential act of God, the projectile hurled by Zeus, the literal bolt from the blue? Yes, we are 97% less likely to be killed by a bolt of lightning. Knowledge. The natural state of humanity is to be illiterate, and literacy for most of human history was a privilege of the few. In early modern Europe, 15% of the population could read and write, and that was brought up to 100% by most developed countries in the 20th century: Netherlands, England, Germany, Italy, United States. And now other parts of the world are replicating that advance. Here you see Chile, here you see Mexico, and here's a graph for the world as a whole. Today, 80% of the world's population can read and write, 90% of the world's population under the age of 20. Not just boys, but girls, I should say. In 1750, only 6 women could read for every 10 who could. England achieved gender parity by the 1900s, as have most developed countries. Indeed, the world as a whole is almost at gender parity for literacy. Even the most backward parts of the world, Pakistan and Afghanistan, are showing huge increases in the rate at which girls go to school, in part a gift that we associate with the other winner of the 2015 Nobel Peace Prize, Malala Yousafzai. And in the most incredible, difficult to believe, astonishing example of progress that I have come across, we have been getting smarter. This is true. In a well-documented phenomenon called the Flynn Effect, IQ scores have increased all over the world by about 3 points a decade for a century, with the result that a person today scores on average 30 points higher on an IQ test than people 100 years ago. This is a product of the expansion of education, of advances in public health, and probably also of the proliferation of technical concepts and visual symbols from technology and other domains of expertise into everyday life. Okay, well, I've talked about a number of things that economists like to measure. What about, does this actually improve the quality of our lives? And the answer is that in many ways it does. 150 years ago, The typical work week in Western Europe and the United States was more than 60 hours. Today it's fewer than 40 hours, and most workers get at least 3 weeks of paid vacation, a entity that would have been virtually inconceivable in the 19th century. And thanks to the universal penetration of running water and electricity, and the widespread adoption of labor-saving devices like washing machines, vacuum cleaners, refrigerators, dishwashers, stoves, and microwaves, the amount of our lives that we lose to housework, which people indicate is their least favorite way of spending their time, has declined from 60 hours a week to fewer than 15 hours a week. Because of the shorter work week and the amount of our lives that we recover from housework, the amount of leisure time in the United States has increased over the last 50 years, both for men and women. Now, you'll see that the amount of leisure time available to women has leveled off, and the reason is that women today spend more time with their children. In fact, a working single woman today spends more time with her children than a stay-at-home married mother did in the 1950s. And we lose less of our paycheck to necessities, food, clothing, and shelter, from 60% a century ago to 1/3 today. Well, does it make us any happier? And the answer is it almost certainly does. Economists note that there is a strong relationship between self-rated life satisfaction and the log of income. This is the regression line. Remember that this is on logarithmic coordinates, so an extra dollar adds much more to the happiness of a poor person than it does to a rich person. But it is a relationship that holds across the income spectrum. Each dot is a country. Each arrow represents the population within a country. The graph shows that people in rich countries are happier than people in poor countries. Within every country, richer people are happier, with the expectation that as the world gets richer, its people get happier. Indeed, the World Values Survey has shown that in 86% of countries for which they have longitudinal data, happiness has increased. I've plotted just a sample of them here. You can see going from the bottom up, Russia, India, there's Germany. Just surprisingly, not a whole lot happier than India, but happier. And also surprisingly, at least for the data on this graph, Germany was less happy than the United States. That has since reversed. Germans are now happier than Americans. Neither of them is happy as Swedes. Has this progress come at the expense of the environment? And the answer is yes, it undoubtedly has, although that is rapidly changing. According to the Environmental Performance Index, a kind of report card on the state of the environment, 178 out of 180 countries have improved in their environmental quality over the past decade. I'll just give you some data from the United States. Since the formation of the Environmental Protection Agency in 1970, the population of the U.S. has increased by 40%. Americans now make 2.5 times as much money on average and drive twice as many miles. However, because of pollution control technology and regulations, Americans emit 60% less of the 5 major air pollutants. More generally, a force that is worldwide force that is going to start to push back against the despoliation of the environment. Among the forces are the growth of affluence, because richer countries have cleaner environments. They can afford to spend more on clean technology. And as people get wealthier, their values change and they start to care more about the environment. Also, richer and better educated countries have fewer babies. And because the world is getting richer and better educated, the projected rate of population growth has peaked and may very well plummet, which would mean that world population may peak by 2070 and start to decline. A process that, of course, is already visible in Europe and in East Asia, but could very well spread to the world as a whole. Just another couple of examples of of environmental progress. In temperate regions of the world, deforestation has pretty much stopped. In fact, it's gone into reverse as abandoned farms are being reclaimed by the forest. In the tropical world, deforestation continues, but it may have reached its peak several decades ago and is now declining, although that, like many of the examples of progress that I've spoken about this evening, could be threatened by the rise of populist politicians, in this case in Brazil. Because of advances in technology, even as the world has shipped more oil by sea, there have been fewer oil spills, and more of the Earth's surface has been protected against economic exploitation, both on land and at sea. The amount of protected areas have doubled. Well, I hope to have convinced you that progress is not a matter of having a sunny temperament or of being a Pollyanna or a Pangloss or seeing the glass as half full. It is an empirical fact. In fact, it may be the most empirical fact in human history. How is the fact of human progress reflected in the news? Well, an algorithm called sentiment mapping, which tallies up the percentage of positive and negative words in news stories, has shown that during all of these decades in which people's lives have been getting longer, healthier, richer, safer, and better educated, the New York Times has gotten increasingly morose, and a sample of the world's broadcasts has also gotten glummer and glummer and glummer. So why do people deny progress? Part of the answer comes from an interaction between our cognitive psychology and the nature of journalism. The human brain often estimates probability with a rule of thumb that Amos Tversky and Daniel Kahneman called the availability heuristic, namely that people in many domains estimate risk according to how easily they can recall examples from memory. Now, this is a heuristic that our own Gert Gigerenzer here has shown is in typical ecological circumstances can be accurate because our memory traces do tend to be strengthened by exposure. So in general, how often you encounter something is not a bad guide to how frequent it is. But whenever there are other factors that influence the brain's search engine so that results come up high on the list for reasons other than frequency, we tend to systematically misestimate the frequency of events. Now, if you combine that with the nature of journalism, news is about stuff that happens. It's not about stuff that doesn't happen. You never see a journalist saying, I am reporting live from a country that is at peace, or a city that has not been attacked by terrorists, or a school that has not been shot up. Also, news is about events, not changes. And bad things can happen very quickly. A bomb can go off, a building can collapse, but good things aren't built in a day, and they can creep up on us. The economist Max Roser has pointed out that the news could have run the headline, 137,000 people escaped from extreme poverty yesterday, every day for the last 30 years. But they never ran that headline, with the result that 1.25 billion people escaped from extreme poverty, and no one knows about it. Also, there is a well-documented bias toward the negative in journalism, captured by this headline from the satirical newspaper The Onion: CNN holds morning meeting to decide what viewers should panic about for the rest of the day. Now, if you combine the availability heuristic with the nature of journalism, you can see why the world is coming to an end, and always has been. There's also a well-documented phenomenon called the negativity bias, that bad is stronger than good. We think about and feel bad events more than good ones, especially recent bad events. We are, in a sense, wired for nostalgia. Even when we remember events from the distant past, we don't remember how unpleasant they were at the time. Explaining an observation by Franklin Pierce Adams, excuse me, that nothing is more responsible for the good old days than a bad memory. There's also market forces in the market for prophecy, for people who see into the future and foretell changes to come. Pessimism sounds serious. As one writer noted, pessimists sound like they're trying to help you. Optimists sound like they're trying to sell you something. Optimism sounds frivolous. Finally, there's a kind of status competition among elites. Society is divided into elites such as the intellectuals, the journalists, the politicians, the business people, the people in technology, religious elites, military elites, and so on. And that gives everyone a temptation to complain about how terrible the state of the world is, because to complain about modern society is a backhanded way of complaining, putting down your rivals. It's a way for academics to look down on business people, for business people to look down on politicians, for political challengers to look down on incumbents, and so on. As Thomas Hobbes put it in the 17th century, competition of praise inclineth to a reverence of antiquity, for men contend with the living, not with the dead. Let me conclude with 3 questions about progress and enlightenment that I suspect have occurred to many of you. Many people ask me, well, isn't it good to be pessimistic, to prevent complacency, to rake the muck, to speak truth to power? Well, not exactly. It's good to be accurate. Of course, we have to be aware of danger and suffering and injustice wherever they occur, but we also have to be aware of how they can be reduced. Because there are dangers to thoughtless pessimism, even if there's dangers of thoughtless optimism, of becoming complacent. One of the dangers of indiscriminate pessimism is fatalism. If everything that people have done to improve the world has been an utter failure, well, why bother? Why throw good money after bad? Why throw money down a rat hole? As Jesus said, the poor you will always have with you. And indeed, if you are convinced that we are doomed, that if climate change doesn't do us in, then runaway artificial intelligence will, the rational response is, well, let's enjoy ourselves while we can. Let our grandchildren worry about the problem. Eat, drink, and be merry, for tomorrow we die. The other danger to thoughtless pessimism is radicalism. If you think that all of our institutions are in a hopeless death spiral and beyond all hope for reform, then the logical response is to smash the machine, drain the swamp, burn the empire to the ground, in the hope that anything that rises out of the rubble and ashes is bound to be better than what we have today. Or to empower a demagogue who promises, only I can fix it. A saying that is all too familiar to Americans over the last 2 years. Second question, is progress inevitable? And the answer is, of course not. Progress does not mean that everything becomes better for everyone, everywhere, all the time. That would not be progress. That would be a miracle. And progress is not a miracle. It's not magic. Progress consists of using knowledge to solve problems. Problems are inevitable, and solutions create new problems that must be solved in their turn. Also, even against the backdrop of continuous progress, there can always be nasty surprises, and I've mentioned a number of them this evening. The world wars, the 1960s crime boom, AIDS in Africa, and the American opioid epidemic. And the world faces severe challenges today, foremost among them being possibly catastrophic climate change and nuclear war. Excuse me. I argue in the book that we should treat these as unsolved but solvable problems rather than apocalypses in waiting, and address climate change via a process of decarbonizing the world's economy via a combination of policy, such as carbon pricing, and low, zero, and eventually negative carbon technologies, including fourth-generation nuclear and carbon capture and storage. We should pursue denuclearization via enhancing international stability to make sure that that countries don't edge toward a crisis, and a program in arms reduction culminating in the complete elimination of all nuclear weapons. An idea that originally sounded like it came from a bunch of beatniks and eccentric professors, but in fact is now embraced by a number of Cold War hawks, such as Henry Kissinger, George Shultz, Sam Nunn, William Perry, Mikhail Gorbachev, and most famously in his time, even Ronald Reagan. Some indications that these are not romantic utopian pipe dreams, but that the world can make progress at dealing with them, come from, I'll just give you a couple of graphs. If you look at how much CO2 countries have to emit to produce a dollar of economic value, a dollar of GDP. See that countries go through an arc over the course of history. Here, the United States and the UK, Germany has a similar U-shaped arc, that with the Industrial Revolution and the burning of massive amounts of coal to power industrial economies, there was a huge rise in CO2 emissions. But then with the transition to from coal to oil to natural gas to nuclear and hydro and renewables, that the carbon intensity of these economies have been turning a corner. Unfortunately, Germany is now becoming more carbon intensive as nuclear plants are shut down and are often replaced by methane and coal. But overall, this has been the trajectory. China went through its version. Now, China literally flew through off the top of the charts during the Great Leap Forward of Mao Zedong, in which he forced peasants to set up backyard smelters and to melt down their woks and their knives and their doorknobs to produce useless steel, with the result that carbon emissions shot through the roof and there was zero economic output until Mao died and China came to its senses and is still decarbonizing its economy. Here you have you see that India's turned a corner, and here's the graph for the world as a whole. Now, crucially, this does not mean that the world is on course to dealing with the threat of climate change for two reasons. One of them is those curves have to get down to zero, and the other is that this is per dollar of GDP, and GDP itself is increasing. But what it shows is there is no law that forces the creation of wealth and industrial economies to depend on flaming carbon. And few people, at least in the United States, are aware of how much the world's nuclear arsenal has been reduced. In fact, it's been reduced by 85% since the height of the Cold War. Again, that is like many examples of progress, that's currently threatened by populist and dictatorial politicians, but there is a precedent for reducing it. In fact, in the United States, about 10% of our electricity comes from decommissioned nuclear warheads, the ultimate turning of swords into plowshares. Okay, my final point. Does the Enlightenment just go against human nature? An acute question for me, who's written a number of books on human nature. It's been said that humanism is just too arid, too tepid, too flattened to get people's heart pounding. That the conquest of disease, famine, poverty, violence, and ignorance are just boring. Do people need to believe in miracles, a father in the sky, a strong chief to protect the tribe, myths of heroic ancestors? Well, I don't think so. For one thing, secular liberal democracies are the happiest and healthiest places on Earth, probably in the history of our species, and they are the top destination of people who vote with their feet. And I dare say that applying knowledge and sympathy to enhance human flourishing is heroic, glorious, maybe even spiritual. It's not just a myth. Myths are fictions, but this hero story is true to the best of our knowledge, which is the only truth we can have. And it's a hero story that belongs not just to one tribe, but to all of humanity, to any sentient creature with the power of reason and the urge to persist in its being. For it depends only on the convictions that life is better than death, health is better than sickness, abundance is better than want, freedom is better than coercion, happiness is better than suffering, and knowledge is better than superstition and ignorance. Thank you.